I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and trends in mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by James Everley, Director of Business Development, Voltpost. On today's episode, we'll discuss how lamppost charging could expand curbside EV access using existing infrastructure. We hope you enjoy this episode. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you here. Voltpost is great design. It's not intrusive. It doesn't look like an eyesore in a city. It looks like, I'll use the term, it just belongs there. It looks like it's part of that pre-existing infrastructure. So the design's really well done. What was the inspiration to design Voltpost, and how did it become in this beautiful form factor? It looks like it's part of the urban landscape.
So it's been a journey, as you may expect. But it's all started with a very simple concept of trying to use more of what is already there. If you can utilize existing infrastructure, you can shorten your deployment timescales and reduce your installation costs. So the number one piece of infrastructure that's already there in towns and cities across not only the US, but in Europe, and I'm originally from the UK, is the humble streetlight, aided by the utility pole, which is also very prevalent, more so perhaps in the US than in some of the European cities. But yeah, so identifying the fact that there are streetlights and utility poles that are located in ideal positions for where you might want EV charging for residents that park on the street. You then think, well, you need a charger. You've got the assets there. How can we use them? And Voltpost is a mission-driven company. We started over 5 years ago. We had some initial sort of prototypes, and gradually through evolution, we're now deploying the Voltpost Air, which we're very excited about. And to your point about it sort of blending in and being part of the environment, we can also customize the wrap of the charger. So if a particular city has like a historic area, it has to be, I think that we had one where it's like, it has to be a Detroit green. We can do that. Equally, we're looking at a project in Connecticut with some schools. We might get the school children to do the design for the wrap, which then forever that charger will be part of the school. So yeah, the design side is quite exciting, but it sort of comes at the end of the journey once you've found a charger that can work for your use case, which is the streetlight.
If you walk around London in the UK, obviously it goes back centuries. The infrastructure and the light posts are different than if you want to use traditional US light pulses. In some cases in London, they look a lot nicer. They look historical, and they're there. How do you integrate the Voltpost into that older infrastructure in the UK? And then how do you get the energy? Because years ago, I read an article in the Financial Times. It said either you can turn the tea kettle on or you could charge your car, and you can't do both. And I'll never forget that FT article.
Yeah, well, I mean, the press is, famous for doing EVs justice. No, I mean, it's a good comment, because you can flip it around and say, well, is the grid really so overburdened that what happens if you flip two kettles on? Are you going to cause the whole thing to short circuit? I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking residential charging is low power and it's typically overnight, which is what the grid wants. What they can't support easily is, huge DC fast charger installations. That needs a lot of careful planning, a lot of infrastructure, because it's like building, like an entire apartment complex in a very small piece of land, which is why those projects can take years. They're vital to the EV charging infrastructure network, but they're very, very different to the residential overnight charging model. So yeah, I've seen those comments for years and years, and I think we're getting to the point now where we're moving past that. It's debunked. The infrastructure in the UK and the US, similar ages depending where you are. I worked for a company called Ubertricity in the UK, which was one of the very first to pioneer the streetlight chargers. And London had a lot of pretty good infrastructure that we could tap into. Deployments were pretty quick. In the US, it's a little bit different, mostly just through different wiring standards that have been adopted over time. But there's still, a good source of power. There's normally one other thing people forget. We were speaking to one city last week, and they have 20,000 streetlights under their control. We don't need to convert all 20,000 today, tomorrow. So we can work with the easiest 1% to convert. That gives us 200 streetlights. The 1% that are closest to the power source, the 1% that are the newest, the 1% that have the best conduit in the ground. We don't need to start with the 1% that are the furthest from the power, that are the oldest infrastructure, that are the most difficult to convert. We may never get to that 1%, or we'll wait for them to be replaced, because every single year, X% of streetlights will be replaced as they age out. With current finances, sometimes that gets delayed a little bit. People sweat their assets more than they would like to, but ultimately, a number of streetlights will be replaced every year. But we aim to start with the easiest conversions, which just makes logical sense to me, at least. And it was the same in the UK.
How do you convert the lamppost for charging? Do you have to tap into existing conduit? What does that conversion look like? And is it different from the UK to the US?
Yes. So the UK electricity system is almost entirely 240 volts. Each streetlight in the majority of cities is directly connected to the mains, the same as your house would be. So each streetlight could easily take a 20 amp EV charger with no upgrade to the wiring, which was wonderful. And it was why London was one of the first real deployment hubs, so to speak, for that technology, because the installations could be done so quickly. Here in the US, typically each streetlight is not connected to the mains individually. It's a string of lights. So you'll have one cable going in and out of all the streetlights. So typically we will seek to utilize the existing conduit that is in the ground and then pull a new wire through to the streetlight. Where it's a utility pole, it's actually a little bit easier because the power is already there overhead. Drop a cable down, install your charger. Slightly simplistic in the sense that you still have to do your good site surveys. Not every utility pole can be converted, but in essence, that's the two main differences.
I worked on a city project almost a decade ago where we're running fiber to the premise and we wanted to run it on poles. And I'm not saying this to be funny. There was something called pole politics, where the utility got, oh boy, they wanted to take control and this regulation, that you can't do this, you can't do that. And then when you finally come to agreement, oh, get in line and wait. There's 1,000 more people in front of you. How do you deal with pole politics?
Carefully. No, utilities are regulated industries and they operate the world over. They are vital pieces of the EV infrastructure jigsaw. In the UK, we worked very closely with them. It was a new concept, streetlight charging. No one had done it before, really. And you have to work closely to educate them about what your power needs are. So I remember we had a conversation with the main utility in London. We said that we had an upcoming project for 1,000 chargers. There are basically 32 municipalities within London. So one of the engineers said, okay, so 32 times 1,000. And we said, no. It's like 1,000 chargers spread across London. And he said, oh, well, come back to us when it's 32,000 chargers, like 1,000 chargers spread across. It's not, so just having the discussion and the education around what you need, what you're planning to deploy, explain the technology, start the conversations early. And it's the same here in the US. We're very fortunate that Exelon was one of our initial investors. They saw the opportunity and the benefit that the technology offers to cities. So we are currently working with a number of utilities across the US to do our initial projects. We've in conversations with others. It's always a new concept for a lot of utilities, but if you think about it, it's not that dissimilar from some of the things that you mentioned. Like if you think of the cell carriers, they're attaching electrically powered devices to utility poles. And so we're trying to replicate those processes. The only difference is we have a charger and a cable lowers down and someone plugs their vehicle in. But it's a similar attachment process, a similar evaluation of the pole from a technical suitability standpoint.
When I'm going to direct this into the US because I have deep understanding of US regulations. When you're deploying in a municipality or a city, do you have to go to city council for approval to modify the poles, or is that done at the utility level? Since in some cases utility owns it, but in some cases the city owns that infrastructure. Do you have to go to the city council for approval?
So it does vary depending on the city and or the town. Different places have different policies. Some cities have more staff resource. They are slightly more empowered. Maybe they've been given a mandate to do level 2 charging. So they've already got the relevant permissions, almost like in perpetuity. So they make the decision and they deploy what they want to deploy, and they just have to stay within their budget. Others, level 2 EV charging is still a relatively new concept. I've presented at the community meetings where they then put it to a vote. Great. We've worked with some of the larger cities where it's a really quick, straightforward process. It depends also slightly whether it's the streetlight or the utility pole, and as you said, who owns it. But that's a relatively straightforward process because, again, the infrastructure is already there. You're making an amendment to it rather than trying to install brand new infrastructure in the right of way, which can be a very long permitting process. We spoke with one utility who had been doing a traditional level 2 deployment. It had been a year, I believe, and they still hadn't got the final permissions to install it.
When you're looking at let's call it a potential deployment, and let's just use a city, for example, are you looking in the residential areas? Are you looking in the business districts? Are you looking in the high trafficked areas? When you're developing the plan to deploy the Voltpost systems, where in cities do you kind of look? Are you using heat overlays, GIS data? Where are you looking to deploy this technology?
So it's a good question. The shortest answer would be everywhere. But I think a better answer is, to be honest, it's a partnership with the city. If you took London as an example, I know London very well. I grew up there, worked there for a lot of years. I don't know all of London. I don't know individual municipalities and where their demand for EV charging is. And it's the same here in the US. You know, some areas where you live, but when you're doing a project somewhere where you don't live, you can't really replicate that local knowledge yourself. So it's a partnership with the municipality. They tend to know where they have people that want EV chargers. Still a little bit chicken and egg sometimes. Over time, if municipalities collect resident demand, like via an online form, the website, etc., that helps. But typically the partnership with the municipalities, you know, they will know where the multifamily homes are. They will know in some cases that there's a lot of EVs at the local library or the leisure centre, partly because they probably had requests from the people managing the facilities or residents have contacted them. But it can be a real mix. You know, some multifamily homes, there's definitely going to be a demand for EV charging. Equally, some of the destination places like the libraries, the leisure centres, they may need some level 2 charging as well. So really it's a partnership with the municipalities.
If you look at the multifamily housing, this is hypothetical, individual comes home from work, say 7 o'clock, 7:30 p.m. They plug the car and make kids dinner. Do they let your data historically charge overnight, or after they put the kids to bed, they unplug the vehicle and move it to be a, if you want to use the term, a good neighbor. What have you seen in your data on that?
So I think there's an understanding that nobody wants to plug their car in to a charger at 7 p.m. at night and then have to wake up at 1 a.m. in the morning and move it. So in London and with Voltpost here in the US, we have basically a model that doesn't penalize anyone if their car is fully charged at 2 in the morning. Any sort of like overstay fees wouldn't kick in until a predetermined time, whether that's 7 in the morning or something like that. Because residential overnight is a very unique model, and it's just unrealistic to imagine people waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning to move their vehicles.
How do you let the individuals in those communities where you're deploying? Because you're going to have one individual or an individual that has anxiety. I don't want to get charged. I don't want to get charged. And then the poor individual can't sleep that night. How do you, when you go into that community and you deploy this, how do you build that trust?
So it's a partnership with the municipality. That's the first piece. And then obviously the residents, the drivers are the second piece. We're very clear and transparent in our communication, with our app about the fees, about the tariffs, what you're going to be charged. The signage on the charger is also important. And again, it can be very clear when different tariffs and things occur. We also have partnerships with people like Eco Movement that make our chargers available on other platforms. So they might see the charger appear on Street View, on Google Maps. So there's work involved to communicate to the residents, but it can be done in partnership with the municipalities, updates on their websites, updates in their newsletters or whatever municipalities send out nowadays. In London, we used to help send out flyers to all the residents in the local areas just to say, hey, there's a charger in your area now. Feel free to come and use it. And this is who's operating it. And this is how it works. Because it's using a streetlight, which is still a new concept to a lot of EV drivers.
When your technology, the Voltposts, are deployed in communities, is there any data where you've seen an uptick in EV ownership where individuals in those communities look to potentially trade in their ICE vehicles to get an electric vehicle because now at home, which is one of the most popular places to charge, they have access to charging?
Anecdotally, I've seen that a lot, yes, in London. We would do an installation and sometimes people would be walking their dog, walk past the charger, see a vehicle plugged in and say, oh, I didn't know this existed. This is so cool. Like, if this is here and I am allowed to use it, then I could now buy an EV. We actually did some small projects with Tesla and Nissan in the UK, where they had people who had placed deposits for vehicles but wouldn't take delivery until the municipalities had put some charging in their streets. We worked with those residents, identified locations where they wanted some chargers, put in the chargers. They would then take delivery of their vehicles. And it sort of demonstrated how to resolve the chicken and egg sort of scenario. Equally, early days in the UK, it was something like 80% of EV owners had access to home charging. Yet in the UK, only about 20% of people have a private garage. So it sort of showed that it was skewed disproportionately to people that had access to like home charging. So there's always been a need for what I've sort of termed as residential on-street charging. It's your charger, it just happens to be on the street. And once you start deploying that, you do see people making the switch. I think it's very hard to document with numbers, but certainly from an anecdotal and case study perspective, I've seen it in action.
Based on the data that you just shared there, is the UK the ideal market for pole charging, to at least to start to build it based on the demographic and the data that you shared?
So London was definitely one of the ideal candidates, it had a high number of EVs, had something like 80 to 90% of residents parking on the street in some areas, a fair number of affluent people living in the city as well, which for the early days of EVs was certainly a factor. You had a choice of like the Tesla Model S, the Tesla Model X. That was it from the Tesla side. And then you had the BMW i3, the Renault Zoe, and maybe one other. Like that was pretty much your choice of EVs at the time, and they weren't that cheap. Combine that with the streetlights that were ideally wired for conversion. London was definitely, there was a reason why it was one of the first in the world to sort of pioneer that approach. They have something in the region of 20,000 streetlight chargers in the UK now. I mentioned there was about 32 municipalities in London. One of those municipalities installed its 2000th streetlight charger at the end of last year. So that sort of gives you an idea of the potential scale when just one of those municipalities has done 2,000 streetlight chargers.
And you started early on deploying pole charging in the UK. What were some of those early conversations like to get to the point now where, if you want to use the term success, it's what's widely available? What were the early conversations like, and what was the turning point to get it to where it is today?
So it was definitely a journey, and I mentioned this a few times, but partnership really is a key piece of the puzzle. Working with we call them boroughs, London municipalities, call them what you will, but working with the boroughs, building trust, showing that the initial pilot of 1 or 5 chargers works, get the feedback from the residents. Hey, they love it. It's working. It's convenient. Going through the technology journey, again, in partnership. If something fails, for example, although I had a background of working with street lighting engineers from an energy perspective, I'd never really been on the ground that much with streetlights. I mean, who does, unless you're a street lighting engineer. We installed some of the original chargers in the base of the pole. One of them stopped working. That pole flooded. Like, it rained a lot, and the pole was at the bottom of a hill, and there was just water inside this pole. So that then informed the next version of the technology. We managed to reshape it, and instead of going down into the base of the pole, it would go up inside the pole. So much less chance of being submerged in water. Also, you could position it so if it did get wet, the water would drain downwards. But things like that are hard to foresee, but we were able to move quickly. We explained the issue, explained that we had a fix for it. And so you maintain the trust and the partnership with the city. And then as you start scaling up, again, you demonstrate that you're solving a problem for their residents. You're collecting more and more user feedback. I won't lie, it also helped that in some of those boroughs, they had almost 1,000 people on a wait list for charging. So it wasn't something they could just ignore. They knew they had to do something for their residents. And the streetlight was the only technology, the streetlight charging was the only technology that would come close to being able to meet that demand. And it's the same here in the US. London happened sooner, but the US is on the same journey. As you have EVs, people living in the city without access to the private garage, you're going to have to be able to charge it conveniently, cheaply, overnight, on street.
Was one of the successes learning by doing? You mentioned the water issue. If you weren't in the field, in my opinion, you probably wouldn't have uncovered that till a long time ago. What else did you uncover out there that completely changed everything for the better?
So one thing would be that not all streetlights are the same. They may look the same, but especially in London, you had a myriad of different designs, ages of poles. It was a good and a bad thing that the borough that we started in happened to have bigger poles than was the average for London. So it was great in the sense that we got to start somewhere. But there was then this false assumption that we could take the same version of the technology and just deploy it across London. We then went into central London, and within a second of looking at the pole, you could just tell it wasn't going to fit. The benefit, though, was we had something already working as a proof of concept. We were then able to redesign the product, make it smaller, elongate the tube instead of having it as a box. And once we could fit into the central London streetlights, we knew that that product would fit 80 to 90% of the poles around the rest of the UK, because we'd found the physically smallest possible designs that could exist.
It's fascinating when you look at, if you want to say, upgrading. Traditionally, at least here in the US, it was the J plug, and now it's gone to the NAX plug because Tesla open sourced it and SAE built that standard. How do you upgrade that infrastructure, especially when it comes to the plugs, and you change the plugs over time without having to go through the whole rigmarole process?
Yes. It's a very short answer. No, we've seen it over time with the DC fast chargers. CHAdeMO was around for a while. Then that went to CCS. There's like a legacy issue where you have one that's CHAdeMO that no one uses anymore and only one that's CCS. In Europe, it's a little bit easier when it comes to level 2 chargers, because you only, as the charge point operator, you only provide the socket. So the driver brings their own cable, and you can have whatever you want on the driver end, whether that's the J plug or the NAX. And then the socket, the plug that goes into the socket, that stays the same. So Europe can switch all their level 2 chargers to be NAX compliant without making any changes at all. The issue will still be there for the DC fast chargers. Here in the US, we can deploy the NAX plug. We can retrospectively go back and change the J plug for a NAX plug, or people can use an adapter. And for a time, for example, if we do a dual port charger on a streetlight, we might have one J plug and one NAX. Over time, as the market, if it does go 100% NAX, then everything will be NAX at some point. But at least in the interim, it's probably 50-50 ratio maybe for some deployments. But then the adapters also work. So,
well, that's a positive. As Voltpost scales across America, how do you see it looking? What does the deployment look like? What cities are you targeting, and what type of adoption are you hoping to achieve as you scale?
It's a good question. In terms of cities, everywhere there are EV drivers parking on street. I mean, to be honest, because if you don't have a private garage, you are going to need some form of level 2 charging curbside. You won't need it every day. You might not even use it every week. We had some drivers in London that would only charge once or twice a month. But by being able to plug in somewhere locally, conveniently, cheaply overnight, then the streetlight or utility pole was a key part of the solution. You still need your DC fast chargers. You still need your destination chargers, but having something that replicated the private garage that happened to be on street was a key part of the puzzle. So we want to work with all the cities long term. In terms of scale, we saw the same in London. You can start with 5, you can start with 10, you move on to 100, 200, 500. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one of the London boroughs recently completed their 2000th streetlight conversion. There's no reason why New York, San Francisco, Boston, all of the large US cities with drivers parking on street wouldn't be looking at those sort of numbers in time.
Yeah, I mean, the one common denominator is that EV charging is scaling, and that pole charging is scaling, because there's a lot of places in the United States and the UK and Europe where you can't put a large charging depot just because of the way that the city's designed it. You need an alternative, and that's exactly what Voltpost is offering. James, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation today, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
I think just an understanding that EV charging is an ecosystem in and of itself, and one solution complements another solution. DC fast charging, in particular, some of the hubs that are being built, they're key. You're on a journey, you're commuting, you need to stop, recharge quickly, continue, or your work vehicle, doing jobs all locally, need to recharge, continue working. What we're trying to solve is the residential aspect. Primarily, there's other use cases, but primarily the residential on-street charging happens overnight, low cost, quick to deploy, and is one of the key parts of the puzzle for cities with a lot of drivers parking on street. And it's a partnership, I guess, coming back to partnership. It is a partnership with the city, partnership with the residents, and we're just excited to be involved, in this journey here in the US.
Well, it's wonderful to be a part of the journey, and what connects the partnership is trust. When the community trusts the city trusts the operator, good things happen and EV charging scales. Today is tomorrow, tomorrow's today, the future is pole charging. James, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, please kindly rate, review, and let us know what topics you'd like for us to explore next.
Be sure to join us next week as we explore battery intelligence software.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.